Hello. I am a wanderer when I'm talking, and I've just been told to stand still. So, goodness. Okay, so stick a stopwatch on and start that. There we go. I'm a little bit apprehensive tonight, and it's not about public speaking particularly, but a wee while ago I was involved in an event at the Museum of London, Docklands, and it was all about public executions, and we were talking about what happens to the body afterwards and stuff like that. And I was packing to leave to go down to London, and my daughter, who's 14, came into the room and asked me what I was doing, and I explained, and I said, I'm off to London to an exhibition about public executions. And my daughter said, will there be a public execution? And, of course, I couldn't let that go. And I said, well, they didn't tell me there was going to be a public execution. So quick as a flash, my daughter said back to me, that means it'll be yours. So I do see some familiar faces out there, but I don't see any lynch mob or pitchforks. So good, we'll crack on, shall we? Thank you for that introduction. I was in the operating theatre a few years ago, trainee in orthopaedic surgery, and we were doing a below knee amputation. And things were taking their time. We were scrubbed and ready to go, and I thought, captive audience. So I started telling everybody in the room about how this particular operation would have happened 200 years ago, for instance, at the Battle of Waterloo. And the boss said, Suzie, you need to take your stories somewhere else. So here we are. Okay, here we go. I had a bit of a think tonight. The title of tonight is the Christmas Charity Lecture. So I came to a bit of a fork in the road when I was thinking about tonight. No, we're not going to say fork in the road, are we? I think we might talk about that bit, you know, where the aorta comes down and then it branches off down the legs. We came to that bit there. And I could have gone down that leg there and been all lectury, because my books, Mortal Monarchs and Vital Organs, they are fun stories about the human body and death and dying and disease, but there is a theme that runs through them, or there are a couple of themes that run through them, and inevitably that's going to happen. If you start writing books about the history of the human body, you're going to start thinking about ethics, and particularly consent, and how over the years those ideas have changed. And so those themes do run through my books. But that's down the lecture leg. And down there is it's Christmas. So down there is Ebenezer Scrooge being all, are there no workhouses? Okay, but there's another leg, and we could go down that leg. And this is Ebenezer Scrooge on Christmas Day leg. How much is that turkey in the window? As soon as I started saying that, I thought the one with the waggly tail, and that doesn't that doesn't work, does it? So Christmas Day, Scrooge, having fun. Okay, so we're going to tell some fun stories about human body parts, and that's the. I am. There we go. So that's those books there. And yes, some poo through the ages, Queen Victoria there. That's to come next year. So hold it in for now, if you will. Right. So this all started a long time ago, you know, in dissection lab, and I started to get this idea of how I might collect stories of body parts. I have said that before, and I forgot to mention the stories part. So I do mean stories and not actual body parts, because that would be weird, even though we're in the college full of them. But no, stories of body parts. And the very first one that I loved was a story about Charles I. This is Charles I here. This is the cover of my book there. I was in a bookshop. I was in Waterstones last week in Aberdeen, and there was a pile of my books, Mortal Monarchs, on a table, which is amazing. And I was standing next to it, being all gooey, which is something that authors do, I've discovered, and having a look at my book. And next to me, there was a young lad. He was about 5 years old, and the cover of this book is embossed. It's lovely. You can touch it. And he was touching it, and he was tracing his finger around this bit here. There you go. And with his other hand, he was holding on to his mum. And he tugged her, and he said, Mum, look at this. This man's head's not attached to his body. And his mum just sort of looked at it and went, come on. I didn't hear what she had said, but she wasn't amused, and I thought, he'll be back. Anyway, some body parts. Charles I. This is the one that I really love to begin with. So Charles I, king, upset quite a few people, upset Parliament, upset the church, and lost. So he had his head chopped off. So the 30th of January in 1649, he's led out onto the scaffold, and the executioner did an all right job, actually, for once. This isn't a botched story. The axe came down, one blow, took his head off. Wonderful. They sewed his head back on, because image is everything, and they took him off to Windsor to bury him. And when they got to Windsor, they found that where they were going to put Charles I wasn't quite right. I'm not sure how. Maybe they'd done it too short, thinking he wouldn't have a head or something. But they couldn't get him in, and they thought, well, we'll just put him in this temporary vault over here at Windsor. This 500-year-old now temporary vault also houses the body of Henry VIII and his wife Jane Seymour and an infant child of Queen Anne. It's all very random, that party. And another coffin. They didn't really advertise where Charles I went because nobody wanted a shrine or a target, so we'll just put him in there and forget about him for a bit. Well, he was forgotten for a while, but George IV, oh, I love this guy. George IV came along in 1813. Actually, he wouldn't have been George IV then, would he? He would have been a regent. But he came along, and they opened up the coffin just for a look, because they wanted to know who this was, even though there was a plaque on it that said Charles I. They weren't happy with that. They wanted to actually have a look. So they opened it up, and the king's physician, was a chap called Sir Henry Halford, looked and said, yes, I can see quite clearly that his C4 there has got a slice through it. Whoops. There you go, slice through it. I destroy things. Okay. So this is definitely Charles I. Excellent. Let's put him back. So they put him back, but not all of him. Because Sir Henry, decided that he wanted to take that neck bone home. So he pocketed it. And he took it home. And he didn't just put it in a drawer. Oh, no. He mounted it in gold and put it on a salt cellar. I love the Georgians. And he put it on a salt cellar, and he had it at his dining room table for years. It was passed around at parties. It's quite a normal thing to do. And, yeah, wonderful. It was kept in the family. Queen Victoria found out about it years later and was not amused and was told to put it back. So this is how it started. I was like, this is amazing. There must be more of these. And so I went off on my travels around the world to find some interesting body stories. Okay, have another drink. My mother used to live in Salisbury, and I used to go down there and visit. And when I did so, I would visit the cathedral. And next to the cathedral in Salisbury, there's a museum. So I like to go around there. And one day I was in the museum, and I met something there, which we'll come to. This is a chap called William Longspay. William Longspay was an illegitimate child of King Henry II. He was a bit of a warrior, and he sided with his brother, his half-brother, Richard the Lionheart. And he was over in France and crusading and all the rest of it. And one day, Richard the Lionheart dropped down dead. Although, no, he didn't, did he? Richard the Lionheart in 1199 was hit in the shoulder with a crossbow bolt. It went gangrenous and horrible and black, and it took him 10 days to die in agony. So he didn't quite drop down dead. But William, oh no, what do I do now? I think I'll go and side with my other half-brother, who's now become king, King John. So he comes back to England, and he's there for King John. John dies, and he's there for John's son, who is Henry III. But one day, in 1226, William Longspay did just drop down dead. And it was 1226, so there wasn't going to be any analysis here, but there were some suggestions that he had been murdered, that this was a poison job. But they couldn't really do anything about it, so they stuck him in a box and stuck him in Salisbury Cathedral. And then the Georgians came along. They dug him up. Well, they didn't dig him up. They pulled him out, and they opened up his coffin for a look. And they found that his skull was a bit caved, and there was something inside it. So they dug about inside his skull, and they pulled out the mummified remains of a rat. Great, isn't it? And they kept the rat. Why wouldn't you? So for years they kept this rat, thinking, well, that came out of his head, it's interesting. But then, when there was a test for arsenic, somebody did it, and found the rat was riddled with arsenic. Which is interesting. How on earth did that happen? Well, I think the rat just came along one day and found the decomposing body of William Longspay and thought, tasty. So started to have a nibble, and got up through the soft tissue into the skull. And he can only have been riddled with arsenic if that's what he'd been eating for lunch. So perhaps William Longspay was full of it as well. So I love that story. And I tell people a lot to go to the museum and you'll see the mummified remains of the rat. The rat's mummified because it was so full of arsenic. Arsenic was used to embalm, probably the American Civil War time was the most. There's Civil War battlefields that are leaching out arsenic at the moment, which is wonderful. I tell people not to lick the rat. Okay. I mean, they have notices on sandwich wrappers saying don't eat, don't they? So you have to be careful now. So that was William Longspay's brain. Wonderful. It was very difficult on my journey to find stories about women because they weren't written about, unless they had something, unless they were Queen Marie Antoinette. She was written about a lot. And Queen Marie Antoinette, I was going to have a look at her head being chopped off because that's the obvious thing, isn't it? But then I found something else that was quite fun, and this was all about her teeth. So Marie Antoinette was the... I'm getting a bit of... are we okay? I'm getting a bit of... Is it just me? It's echoey feedback. We are. Okay. I'll carry on. Where were we? Marie Antoinette's teeth, yes. So she was the Archduchess of Austria, wasn't she? Her mother was Maria Theresa, the Empress. Her father, the Holy Roman Emperor. She was going to make a political marriage, and the most obvious was going to be the Dauphin of France, Louis. So an envoy was sent to go and see her when she was young, and he came across Marie Antoinette and wrote home saying, yeah, she's a bit of a mess. Need to sort her out. Particularly, she has very wonky teeth, and we need to do something about this. So she was taken and given treatment for her wonky teeth. Not something unusual today. I forced my 14-year-old through it, in fact. But this was unusual. Excuse me, because it was new. There was a chap called Fauchard, who was a dentist, a celebrity dentist at the time, who created this iron arch, I suppose, which he pushed up into her mouth. And then through holes in that, he would push gold wire and wind it around her teeth. And then every day they'd wind it up and wind it up and wind it up. And it altered the shape of the arch. And she had lovely, lovely straight teeth when her head rolled off the guillotine on the Place de la Concorde in 1793. My daughter, when she learned that story, she said, "Can I have gold wires on my braces?" No. Actually, this story I told on TikTok, and I didn't mention the word braces because I thought it was funny not to. And that was very wise because it had millions of views because a million people wanted to tell me, oh, are these just braces? Yes. Anyway, so Marie Antoinette's wonky teeth, I think, might have been not because she liked cake, not because she was heavily influenced by ultra-processed foods. No, it's because she had Habsburg blood. And if you have Habsburg blood, there's a chance that you might have a bit of a Habsburg jaw. Hello, Charles. So this is Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of the Spanish Empire. Charles II of Spain was known as the Bewitched. He was the result of generation upon generation of inbreeding. Cousins, nephews, and nieces and uncles, and I can't even explain it, but lots and lots of inbreeding. And it got to the point where a lot of children were not making it, but Charles strangely did. And you have to look at this image and remember that these were painted by people who were trying to flatter the sitter. This is not an Oliver Cromwell warts and all job here. You can imagine that this was much more than we're seeing here. Now, Charles had a lot of problems, a lot of physical, a lot of mental problems. He didn't speak before he was 4. He didn't walk before he was 8. They didn't bother to educate him. Why bother? We're not going to do that. He was said to be so ugly that he scared his wife. He did have a wife. He had 2 of them because he was the king, but they didn't produce an heir, and nobody believes that was the fault of his wives. Okay. So as a result, there was no heir, and Charles II of Spain was, as I said, the last Spanish ruler of the Habsburg ruler of the Spanish Empire. And when he died in 1700, this led to the War of Spanish Succession, which went on for years. Charles II of Spain had an autopsy of sorts, and I don't know whose side the medic was on, but it's really funny. He said that Charles II had not 1 drop of blood. He said his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his bowel was diseased and corrupted. He said he had 1 shriveled, blackened testicle, and he said his brain was, his head was full of water. There's some interesting things in there, aren't there, which could well have been, we could talk about. But that's an incredible jaw and nose that Charles II of Spain was carrying there. With the body parts that I went looking for, there were all sorts of different categories. And when I eventually wrote the book Vital Organs, I decided to be systematic and work my way down, head to toe. But we could have gone around the world, or we could have gone into different categories. So there were body parts that I looked at that were stolen, body parts that were put on display, body parts that started wars, relics, body parts that led to medical, sorry historians, I'm going to say the word advancements. All sorts of different body parts in different categories. And so we're going to go and start some wars, I think. And we already talked about the War of Spanish Succession, actually. But at the end of the War of Spanish Succession, the British were awarded the asiento, which was a deal, a monopoly, if you like, with Spain, that the British would supply slaves to the Spanish. The slaves had a lot going on in the Caribbean, in the ports of what's now Panama and Mexico, but they didn't have much influence in West Africa. And the British then sold 5,000 slaves a year to the Spanish. And also in the deal, the British could go into various ports and do some trading. And also in the deal, the Spanish were allowed to stop British ships and see what was going on there, see if there was any contraband. And so one day in 1731, a chap called Robert Jenkins, a seafarer, left Jamaica heading for England, and his ship was full of sugar, as it should have been. And he said there was nothing else. And a Spanish ship came alongside and boarded and had a good look round and found nothing but sugar. And the captain, Juan de Leon Fandino, what a great name, the captain came along and had a look and was very upset that he didn't find anything else. So he beat up Robert Jenkins, he held him down and he sliced off his ear. And he said, and if your king comes a knock-in, we're going to do that to him as well. So you take this back to your king and tell him what happened. So that's what Robert Jenkins did. He put his ear in some wine, what a waste, and he took it back to England, and he took it to Parliament, actually. This is Robert Jenkins here, without an ear, and this is Walpole saying, no, thank you very much, not interested. And for Robert Jenkins, everything went quiet. Sorry. Not really sorry. For a while it went quiet anyway, and then the Tories wanted to get rid of Walpole and his long-standing Whig government and wanted to have more going on in the Caribbean, wanted more trade, and so they wanted to go to war with Spain. And if you want to go to war with somebody, you've got to have a reason, and what better reason than, look what the Spanish are doing! They cut off this guy's ear. So we went to war with Spain and lost. And this Thomas Carlyle wrote about this a few years later and called it the War for Jenkins' Ear, which I love. And it's kind of forgotten in some circles. I was at a school that I won't name in Glasgow giving a talk, and a history teacher came up to me afterwards and said, you have to write about the War for Jenkins' Ear. And you could see he was so passionate about it that I did that just for him. But yeah, it's a good story, isn't it? There was something else I was going to say about him. It was probably a bad joke, so should we move on? Okay. One thing that I really love to tell, one story that I love to tell, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I'm wandering, sorry, I'll come back here. I had absolutely nothing to do with it, but I do love the story of how the bones of Richard III were identified. Not necessarily found, that's a fun bit as well, but how they were identified. Because I think, certainly within my lifetime, so 50 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do any of that. If they had dug up, if George IV, had come along and dug up the bones of Richard III, he'd have gone, yeah, he's got a bit of a head injury and he's got a bit of scoliosis, might be the chap. But now we can look and we can do, we can stick him in the CT scanner and we can do DNA analysis and carbon-14 dating and all that wonderful stuff. And we can even do, can't think of the word, it's gone. Sorry? I thought somebody was giving a suggestion. I was going to say ground penetrating radar in case that was what you were thinking. Probably not. We can do all of those things, and that's wonderful for the story of Richard III because it was a brilliant thing that was done there. But sometimes I found myself a little bit irked that all this wonderful new technology was kind of putting a stop to a lot of stories that we like to tell. This was supposedly the skull of Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots' second husband. He was a scoundrel and he was a murderer, and he came to a sticky end, a strange end, not far from here, actually. And he was embalmed and he was stuck in the, let me get this right, the Abbey Church at the Palace of Holyrood House. He was in there until the roof collapsed in and somebody went along with a bag and a shovel and nicked his head and wandered off with it. And this head was passed about, and it was at some point the Scottish Society of Antiquities had it, and then somebody else had it. And then, weirdly, suddenly there were two skulls that were claiming to be that of Lord Darnley. Not the actual skulls, that would be weird, they don't talk, but you know what I mean, people were saying these are the skulls. So one was here in Edinburgh, and the other one was with the Royal College of Surgeons in England. And they were both claiming to be Lord Darnley, and for years nobody really knew, they both said this is us. And the one down in London was studied and images were made, and that was great because it was destroyed during the Blitz. So we don't have that one anymore. But in 2016, maybe something like that, a lass called Emma Price was studying at the University of Dundee. They had this amazing facial recognition. Oh, that was what it was, facial recognition. Cool. They were doing that, and she looked at the images, she looked at portraits, she looked at this skull, and she decided that the one down in London was most likely, or the one no longer down in London, was most likely to be that of Lord Darnley. Which is a shame, really, isn't it? Because this one looks great, and somebody's even written on it, look, Lord Darnley. So, I mean, that's it. Who is it? Nobody knows. It's a shame, isn't it? Yeah? Same thing happened to Shakespeare. Shakespeare's head was stolen, maybe. There's a long story about that and what happened to it. There was ground-penetrating radar, that's what I was talking about earlier. That was done over his grave, and it kind of looks like there's a bit missing where his head should be. And Shakespeare wrote a curse on his grave. Well, he didn't, obviously, but somebody did. Saying, if you come along and dig me up, you're in trouble. So nobody wants to dig him up. But they did some ground-penetrating radar and had a look, and they found that there's a gap. So Shakespeare's skull might not be where we'd like it to be. Well, I mean, I'd like it to be where there has been a claim that a skull in a church not far from where he's buried, it's been sitting there for years, there's a claim that that belongs to Shakespeare. And everybody just goes to see it and goes, that's Shakespeare's head, isn't it obvious? And everybody just accepts it. But annoyingly, some people with technology came along and scanned it and did all the good things that you do and discovered that this was probably the skull of a 80-year-old woman. Which doesn't really fit. We can't really squeeze William Shakespeare into that. So it just happened again. This technology, I'm so annoyed. So there you go, there's another head. We're going to stay with heads for a while because some of you might like to hear about what happened to Oliver Cromwell. In 1660, Charles II came back and the monarchy was restored, and he took revenge on the people that killed his dad. He went out and executed them. And if they were already dead, so what? He dug them up and did it anyway. And that's what happened to Oliver Cromwell. They went and took him out of the wall at Westminster Abbey where he was interred, and they strung him up and then they chopped his head off anyway. And his head they put on a spike above Westminster Hall, looking down on where Charles I had been sentenced, I suppose. And so it was up there for a very long time. It was well embalmed. It was up there for a while, and then a storm came along and knocked it off, and it bounced along the ground. And a guard came along and picked it up and took it home. You would, wouldn't you? He took it home and he put it in his fireplace up his chimney, which is a bit weird because it was the middle of winter, and I hope he told his wife, because she would have lit the fire. And anyway, it survived, and he sold it, and it was passed about. It was passed about between booksellers, weirdly, strange people, and there goes my pile of books on the Waterstones table. So it was passed around at parties and all sorts of things. It was put on display, it was bought and sold, and eventually ended up with a family in England who had it looked at in about 1913 by a couple of academics who said this was, with moral certainty, the head of Oliver Cromwell. I have no idea what that means, but that's what they said it was. And the head, well, after a while, it was thought maybe we should bury this. So it was put in the ground at Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge, and only a few people know exactly where, because there's quite a lot of people that would like to play football with Oliver Cromwell's head. Speaking of playing football with someone's head, we're coming back to Scotland. This is James IV of Scotland. James IV of Scotland met a sticky end at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. He was another one who had an arrow in the face, but he didn't survive, and it just destroyed his jaw, and then he was, hacked to death. But George IV's body was not brought back to Scotland. It was taken down to London via Berwick, weirdly. They embalmed it, and they took it to Sheen Priory down in London. But the problem was that James IV had been excommunicated from the church, so they couldn't just bury him. That was a problem. So Henry VIII wrote to the Pope. He wrote to the Pope. He didn't WhatsApp him. This wasn't going to be a quick answer. He wrote to the Pope and said, what shall I do with this body? And the Pope wrote back, and by the time the message got back, everyone had moved on. And the body of James IV of Scotland lay on a shelf in a storeroom in Sheen Priory for 50 years. Nobody really bothered with it until one day some workmen knocked it over and the head fell off, and they kicked it about like a football. Amazing. I love that. Actually, while we're here, I haven't got him in, but while we're here, James IV's son, James V, supposedly died of a broken heart. I was telling that story one day in the history department in Aberdeen, and I was met by a very grumpy history professor who said, no. You can't die of a broken heart. I said, oh, really? So this is a chap who had been having a go at me because I had spent years studying and working as a medic, and I hadn't been in his classes for all those years learning German or whatever he wanted me to learn. So he was a bit annoyed with me about that. So I told him about Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. That shut him up, but I think it was just because he just was like, yeah, well, okay, move on. Again, when I was looking through all these, again, I'm talking about kings, aren't I? I'm talking about guys, and there's a lot written about them. Of course there is. And it was very, very hard to find any body parts from famous women. The thing was that I didn't want to write just about general body parts. I could tell you lots about people with syphilis losing their noses, but in actual fact, I wanted to write about somebody specific. And so that made it quite tricky when I was looking for body parts. And so I was very excited when I came across the story of Frances Burney. Fanny Burney was a novelist, a 19th century novelist, who felt a lump in her chest one day, and it started to become sore, and she spoke to a surgeon who was like, well, let's cut it out, because that's what you're going to get if you speak to a surgeon, is it not? So they got ready. They didn't do it. They didn't do it in an operating theatre. They did it at home because she was well-to-do, and they got her in a bedroom. They got sheets, which were old because they didn't want to ruin any new ones. They knew what was coming, and they put a handkerchief over her face because that works. In the absence of anaesthetic, that works wonders. They put a handkerchief over her face. She could see through it. So when she wrote a letter to her sister 9 months later explaining the experience, she wrote in great detail about how she was lying there and she saw the blade, the shine of the blade coming down towards her chest. And she wrote about during the mastectomy, she felt the knife pushing against her breastbone. She felt everything, and she wrote about it in great detail. And we have that because she was she was a novelist, she was literate, she was educated. I think it's the British Library that have those letters, and they are wonderful, and I would implore you to have a look at those, should you be interested. So we got on to the stories of operations. Excellent. Who's that? Yes, go for it, Samuel Pepys. Samuel Pepys, our friend, the diarist of the 17th century. We're going a bit further south now. We've done some heads. We looked at Fanny Burney's chest, and now we're going a bit further south because Samuel Pepys, I like to tell everyone about his bladder. He was only a young man. He was in his 20s, as I recall, when he started to get sore with a bladder stone, and it got so bad that he decided to undergo the knife. And it would have been really bad, because that's a difficult decision to make. I mean, they waited, it was about this time of year, but they waited till March so that they could get more light in the room. And in that time, he was in a lot of pain. And the operation then for removing a bladder stone was that they would have to put a rod up through the urethra and wiggle it about a bit until it struck stone. And then it hold that nice and still against the bladder wall, and then go in from underneath. So up through the perineum, make a cut, pull out that stone. And it was huge. It was a massive, great thing. And Samuel Pepys kept it in a box for years because his problem was solved. He was pain-free. And he celebrated on the 26th of March every year. He celebrated Pain-Free Day and would have people round and show them this enormous stone that was cut from his bladder. It's great that he was able to tell us about that and write that down. I love that story as well. When I was down at the old operating theatre in London last year at an event, there was a young lad in there who was going around with his dad, another young lad, and he pointed up at these rather graphic images on the wall of said operation, and he said to his dad, "What's going on there?" And his dad sort of went, "Oh, I don't know, son. I don't know." And I didn't sort of get the cue. Instead, I stepped in and went, "Well, I'll tell you." And I had daggers from this father for a while there. That was fun. Anyway, bum operations. Let's move on. I've become known a little bit online for my discussion about Louis XIV's rear end. If you're going to be known for something, okay. I mean, Louis XIV had a lot of problems. He loved a good enema. I mean, that's a problem in itself. But he had loads of them. If you had an audience with the king, the likelihood was that he was having an enema while you were talking to him. Anyway, Louis XIV. Lots was written about him. There's lots going on. But in 1686, he had a bit of a sore bum. And, of course, like he should have done, no. He left it alone. No. He prodded and poked, and it got worse. A bit dry, sorry. He prodded it and he poked it, and it got worse, and it turned into an abscess. And his physicians put poultices on, and they put red-hot irons on it, and tried all sorts, and it didn't work, and so it got worse and developed into a fistula. So we've got a track now, an extra hole, if you like, and a new track. And the physicians thought, well, maybe it's time to speak to a surgeon. I realise I'm on unsteady ground here, so I'll behave. So they spoke to the lowly surgeon, who was a chap called Felix, who came along and he had a look. I don't know why I did that, but sorry. He had a look between the king's legs, and he said, I'd like to do something about this, but I'm not sure quite how. So give me some time. And he went out and practiced on the people of Paris. He found people in the hospitals and in the prisons, and he developed an operation to deroof this fistula. He developed some tools, and he went back to the king when he was ready. And he spent 4 hours between the king's legs doing just that. Obviously, pre-anesthetic, pre-antiseptic, pre-all those things. And the king survived, incredibly. Felix never operated again because the king just gave him land and money and all sorts of stuff. And you would, wouldn't you? You just went off into the country to his new estate. He's not doing any of that anymore. But the king also recognised surgeons more after that. Not so much that one was called for when his leg went gangrenous, and that's what killed him. So Louis XIV's rear end was so popular amongst the people of the French court that they would ask surgeons for a fistula operation whether they had one or not. Anyway, moving on. One of the other things that I found really interesting when I was looking for my body parts was not so much body parts, but I got really interested in accidental holes. Just hear myself saying that, I realise how very strange I am. But I got really interested in accidental holes. And this is a chap called Purefoy Lockwood, who was an Irishman who was an officer in Wellington's army. He didn't make it to Waterloo. He was at Quatre Bras, a preliminary battle, if you like, a couple of days before Waterloo, and he was shot in the head. I think it was losing a bit of energy at the time because it didn't go all the way in, just smashed his skull up a bit. It was a bit messy, but the surgeons were able to get in and take out the musket ball and also bits of skull, and he was left with a hole. But he was okay, survived that. Purefoy Lockwood went home and had a plate made that he would wear over the hole for the rest of his life. And he had the word bomb-proof written on it. And he would show it off at parties, and they would call him Bomb-proof Lockwood. He'd be like, look at my brain. Brilliant. So that was the first hole in the body that I got excited about. I can't believe I just said that. And I found this chap called Hugh Montgomery. Hugh Montgomery was in the 1600s, a young lad, and there's varying stories. So one is that he fell out of a tree, and another was that he was kicked by a horse, but either way it wrecked his ribs, and he was left with a big hole in his chest. And you could look through that hole and see his heart beating. He survived, which was incredible. William Harvey of Heart is a Pump fame, William Harvey got to know him and took him to see the king. It's King Charles putting his hand in the hole to touch the beating heart. I'm guessing that would also cure the king's evil and he wouldn't get scrofula after that, but it's probably the least of his concerns. He did say that his heart felt nothing. Kindred spirit. Now listen, this story I've always told, saying that he willingly went to see the king. But I've never included this in a talk before. So when I went looking for an image of Hugh Montgomery and I found this one, I got a bit of a surprise, because that and that and that and all of that doesn't look willing to me. So I'm going to go back and have a look into this, because I don't like saying it was willing if it wasn't. That's really interesting, isn't it? I'm going to go back and look that up. So next year I'll tell you all about how he didn't go willingly. That was another hole in the body. And this is an even better one. In the 1820s, there was a chap in Michigan called Alexis St. Martin, who was a fur trader. He was illiterate. He had a job trading furs up and down the river. And one day he was at a trading stand, chatting away to people around him, and he was accidentally shot in the chest at close range. So much so that his clothes were on fire, and it was a horrible mess. And luckily for him, there was a surgeon nearby at the local military base. So he was called in, came and had a look, and he described the situation. He said there was rib everywhere, and there was lung sticking out, and it was all messy. And he shoved it all back in. And despite Beaumont, who was the doctors, despite his intervention, Alexis St. Martin survived. And he survived for a long time. But the problem was that he was illiterate, and because of this injury, he could no longer work in the job that he had before. And Beaumont saw this as a bit of an opportunity. So he took Alexis St. Martin into his house, and he gave him a job as an odd job man. And in exchange for him being a bit of a guinea pig, really, and Beaumont spent the next few years experimenting on this hole into his stomach. Did I mention the fact that the hole went into his stomach? That might have been pertinent. In the beginning, he couldn't drink whiskey, which is a terrible shame. It would go in and it would all fall out again. That was what really upset him. But yeah, he had this hole into his stomach, and Beaumont thought, I'm going to experiment on this chap. He would put bits of food on string and put it in the hole and then time it and then see what had happened digestion-wise. And it was actually really useful, because until that point, animals had a tendency to die if you tried doing things like that. Until this point, I hadn't been able to see into the stomach like this, so it was kind of handy. But again, there are all these issues of consent, and it's all a bit... Alexis St. Martin did run away at one point. He went off, he got married, he had kids. Not before the day that Beaumont stuck his tongue in the hole to see what it would taste like. Doctors are weird, aren't they? Yeah, so Alexis St. Martin went away and he lived a lot longer than Beaumont. Beaumont died, and there were some other army doctors that tried to get in on the case. When Alexis St. Martin died, the army sent the family a bag and a note saying, "We'd still like to experiment on this stomach. Can you send it back to us?" To which the family said, "Absolutely not. If you come anywhere near us, you will be shot. Stop." And they put his body out into the sun to decompose so that it would be rendered useless to anyone who wanted to do any more experiments on Alexis St. Martin. Beaumont actually became known as the father of gastric medicine. What a great expression. And he wrote a book about it, became very well known for his knowledge of the stomach. But it was this chap, Alexis St. Martin, who gave him that opportunity. All right then, let's do it. I have to say, there is nothing about this image, there is nothing about this portrait that makes me want to talk about Napoleon's penis. But I'm going to anyway. Napoleon died in, 1821. Europe had moved on, he was on this slab. And at his autopsy, there were 16 people in the room, and they all agreed that he had died of a stomach cancer. His father had died of the same thing. Napoleon thought differently. He thought he was being poisoned, and there were a lot of symptoms that suggest that. And there was poison in his hair, and in his medicine, and in his wallpaper, and all the rest of it. But that's by the by. That's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is that the guy that did the autopsy thought it might be fun to take his genitals. Just sliced them off, handed them to the priest, who smuggled them off the island. And we're going to bring the booksellers back into it again because they bought and sold the penis, and it was put on display, and it did the rounds. It ended up in America, and a chap called Latimer, who was a urologist, bought the penis. And he said that he didn't want it on display anymore, which is good, isn't it? Good chap. So I thought. Because it turned out that Latimer was a bit odd himself. And although he was a urologist and he had an interest in the penis that way, he also had an interest in dark military memorabilia. He was at Nuremberg trials, and so he had lots of Nazi memorabilia and lots of strange, weird, medical-related. He had a cellar full. So this was just one part of his collection, but he did say he didn't want it on display anymore. Being a urologist, he went away and studied said item. He x-rayed it and all the rest, and he said, "This is definitely a penis, but we don't actually know it's Napoleon's." But that doesn't matter, does it? Because we just loved saying that this is Napoleon's penis. And when Latimer died, it was passed on to his daughter, who's a little bit squeamish about it, but she doesn't want anyone taking photos or going to see it, really. She keeps it in a case in her cellar in New Jersey. Apparently, everything's legal in New Jersey. That was niche. Sorry. So Napoleon's penis story won't go away, really. And people are fascinated by it. And when I start talking about body parts, a lot of people bring it up. And it's going to happen, isn't it? There are penises on display all around the place. There's a whole museum dedicated to them in Iceland. I haven't managed to get there yet, but it's on the list. So there's a whole museum up there, and they're everywhere, these displays of penises. Right. And in Moscow, there's another one. Grigory Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen, friend of the, I'm not going to start dancing, don't worry. So Grigory Rasputin took a very long time to die. He took a very long time to be murdered. That's another story altogether, which is wonderful. But in Moscow, there's a museum that believes that they have on display Grigory Rasputin's penis. They're very, very proud of it. It's huge. And it's in a jar in a museum. And I saw a museum curator had written about it once. And he stood there shouting at the West, basically saying, "You might have Napoleon's shriveled tiny penis, but believe me, our penis is bigger than your penis." And I can't help but think that this is kind of the way of the world at the moment with Russia and the West, isn't it? They're standing at the border shouting exactly that, are they not? Anyway, so apparently somebody studied it and decided it was a sea cucumber. I don't even know what that is. I've never seen a sea cucumber, but I might take up scuba diving. There's a lot of stories that I haven't told because we don't have all night. And I would love to tell you about Tycho Brahe's nose, or Louis Braille's eyes, or Douglas Bader's legs, or relics. We haven't talked about relics. The Catholics love a good body part, don't they? They love heads and fingers and all sorts of things. But my favourite of all has to be the secular relic that belongs to Galileo. Galileo upset the church quite a lot with his theories about what was at the centre of everything. The church didn't like it, and they said that he was a heretic. And when he died, he wasn't buried in the cathedral with lots of honours. He was put in a little church. Let's forget about this horrible heretic. And then a few years later, he was vindicated, and they were like, okay, let's take him out. Let's put him in a cathedral and celebrate Galileo. And on the way, another member of the Society of Antiquarians, love these guys, just snapped off his fingers, put them in his pocket. And one of them is now on display in a museum in Florence. And what I love about this finger is that, they could have displayed it any way they wanted, couldn't they? They could have, anatomical position, or they could have put it in a box, in a nice display box, like Harry Potter's wand or something. But no, they stuck it in a jar like that. I'm going to send you out into the cold, wet night. I'm very sorry, but I hope that you have some fun stories to tell at the Christmas dinner table and take a very close look at the salt shaker.